Good morning. My name is Nancy Wright, and I teach political science at Pace University in New York City. For many years, I also taught political science at Long Island University's Brooklyn, New York campus, where I designed and taught seminars on small sovereign states. Today, June 4th, 2020, I shall present a talk which I have titled Resistance and Uncertainty, introducing Dominica as a microcosm of survival in colonialism and globalization. Within the context of my work on small sovereign states, I was motivated to focus on Dominica in large part by the theme of this year's Common Ground Network's Global Studies Conference, namely globalization and social movements, familiar patterns, new constellations. A bit later in this talk, I shall speak of the fundamental influence of Dominica's Maroons on its resistance to colonization and evolution to independence. While clearly not a social movement, one might look at the ongoing resistance of the Maroons in Dominica as serving a similar purpose of confronting injustice and fostering unity. In turn, one might consider whether the legacy they imparted continues to serve Dominica in its ongoing struggle to cope with the impacts of globalization. I also place my choice of Dominica in the context of assigning to research and pedagogy in international relations and comparative politics a higher priority to small sovereign countries than has been customary. I use the term state to denote the political definition of a sovereign territory with a defined population and legally recognized land area, though I occasionally alternate that term with country, which is used more interchangeably. The term small state within the discipline of political science can be difficult to define. As Jean Hay noted in her edited volume on small states and foreign policy behavior, you know it when you see it. As she and other contributors to that book make clear, this relativity can be fraught with irony. For example, the small state of Israel is nevertheless consistently pivotal in Middle East politics. Jamaica and Trinidad are generally considered small in a global context, but are leaders in the Caribbean region. Paraguay must feel small, sandwiched between Argentina and Brazil. And a former student of mine once wrote a research paper on Kazakhstan for my small state seminar, making a very convincing argument that, while not small in the absolute sense, situated between China and Russia, places Kazakhstan's size in a totally different perspective. All that said, some sovereign states are unquestionably small. Political scientists often identify these as microstates, usually classified as having a total population of fewer than 1 million, a categorization that includes approximately 40 sovereign states. About 32 of these have populations of fewer than 500,000 and or a non-sea area of fewer than 1,000 square kilometers. One of these is Dominica. Dominica is situated toward the front of the Caribbean tectonic plate. As a result, it is the most rugged and most mountainous island in the Caribbean island chain and houses the highest concentration of live volcanoes on the planet. It is also the most heavily forested island of the Lesser Antilles. On the one hand, Dominica is a microcosm of much of the global South. It confronts the same issues of globalization, climate change, and human security that face many small countries, as well as regions within larger countries, especially islands. On the other hand, Dominica is distinguished from other Caribbean islands in several important ways. First, it was the last of the Caribbean islands to be colonized, largely due to the extremely rugged, impenetrable terrain I noted earlier. Second, it is the only Commonwealth former colony to establish itself as a republic directly after gaining independence. Trinidad and Guyana became republics some years following independence. Third, despite centuries of struggle, Dominica boasts the world's highest percentage of centenarians per capita in the world, with 3 times the average number of centenarians in countries of the global north. I shall now present a summary of key dimensions of Dominica's history. The summary is drawn almost entirely from the work of Dominica's premier historian and anthropologist, Lennox Honeychurch, whose seminal work stands as the authoritative study of Dominica's past and present. On this point, I would like to interject that this illustrates the scarcity of scholarship on very small countries. Were it not for Honeychurch, this island's history might not be recorded at all. I am not able to post a PowerPoint for this, so I will tell you the complete title of Lennox Honeychurch's book, his latest book, from which I draw this history. He has written a number of other books. I will also spell his name. The last name is Honychurch. First name Lennox, like X-ray. The title of the book is The Fighting Maroons of Dominica. Maroons, Maroons. Published in London and in Trafalgar, Dominica by Papillote Press in 2017. So I would encourage everyone to seek out this book and other books written by Honeychurch. He stands as the noted historian and anthropologist of Dominica. He himself is Dominican, and he's also served in Dominican government as well. And I would like to interject again that this illustrates the scarcity of scholarship on very small countries. Were it not for Honeychurch, this island's history might not be recorded at all. Also possibly of interest may be a novel, Black and White Sands, A Bohemian Life in the Colonial Caribbean by Elma Napier. Elma, E-L-M-A, Napier, N-A-P-I-E-R. Napier, who was Lennox Honeychurch's grandmother, was the first woman elected to a Caribbean parliament. Prior to the arrival of the British, the island's mountainous interior had provided refuge for the indigenous Kalinago people, who had been driven from neighboring islands. To date, Dominica is the only Eastern Caribbean island to have indigenous Kalinago living there. I'm going to interrupt myself again to share another resource. This is a documentary titled The Quest of the Carib Canoe, which you can access free of charge on YouTube. It's just under 1 hour. It narrates the experience of Dominican Kalinago who traveled by traditional canoe in search of their Kalinago compatriots in South America. In addition to meeting other Kalinago, those on the expedition planned ways to continue to advocate for the Kalinago people, including endeavors to preserve the various dialects of their language. This can be extremely valuable in the classroom because there are many people who believe that the indigenous that Columbus discovered are essentially extinct, which is not the case. And certainly the Kalinago are far from extinct. And this could be a very valuable way to introduce students to the indigenous people of the Caribbean. Returning to the history of the island, Christopher Columbus arrived with his ships on Dominica on November 3rd, 1493. Ignoring the island's Kalinago name, which was Waitukubuli, meaning tall is her body, Columbus named the island Dominica, since the landing occurred on a Sunday. Columbus and other Spaniards disseminated the misinformation that the people they encountered were cannibals, though for many years the Kalinago people were not aware of this superimposed image. A major paradox is that as more and more Africans came to Dominica, all speaking a multitude of different languages, the language of the Kalinago would have in all likelihood become the lingua franca. Yet very little work has been carried out on words adopted from the Kalinago in pre-colonial Dominica. The one exception is the work of British linguist Douglas Taylor, an early 20th century pioneer in Creole languages who spent over 4 decades on the Dominican estate of Magua, researching and documenting Dominican Creole. Despite this dearth of linguistic scholarship, the legacy of the pre-Columbian Kalinago remains very salient even today, a phenomenon that further distinguishes Dominica from its Lesser Antilles counterparts. The beginning of Dominica's colonial plantation economy and society marks yet another unique feature. The first person to establish a permanent plantation and bring enslaved Africans to Dominica was Jeannot Roch, a free black man from Martinique. To date, Dominica is considered the only Caribbean island to have its first plantation established by a black person. This beginning set the stage for ongoing internal tension through the island's colonial history. The French colonized Dominica from 1715 to 1763. However, as early as March 31st, 1660, the Treaty of St. Christopher concluded between the English and the French declared Dominica, as well as St. Vincent, to be neutral, not to be occupied by any European power, but to remain with the Kalinago people indefinitely. The treaty exemplified the archetype of the noble savage, perpetuated by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and other philosophers of the European Enlightenment. Two other major reasons were to prevent a surplus of sugarcane and consequent declining revenues, and also to establish a buffer for the neighboring sugar colonies. Although none of these reasons genuinely supported Dominican independence, the neutral status endowed the Maroons with the century to establish a strong base on Dominica, thus further distinguishing the island from its colonized neighbors. Nevertheless, this neutrality contributed to a bittersweet outcome as well. The strong rapport between the Kalinago and the Africans that characterized the early years of encounter, formed by their resistance to a common enemy, waned from 1700 onward, since the Kalinago had no reason to challenge the French or the British. Although the Kalinago were forced to shift their settlements to the more rugged east coast, as well as engage in certain commercial interactions with the plantation owners, they largely sequestered themselves from the conflicts between the Maroons and the Europeans. They had lost their lands to the colonizers, but had maintained their independence through self-isolation and non-confrontation in the face of European policies based on an image of the noble savage that, however distorted, the Kalinago strategically fulfilled. In 1764, the British took possession of Dominica from France following the conclusion of the Treaty of Paris the year before. In 1778, the French recaptured Dominica, and for the next 5 years, the importation of enslaved Africans essentially halted. Quarreling among European powers weakened the colony, which in turn fostered strength among the Maroons. With the dawn of the 19th century, Maroon resistance intensified, culminating in a guerrilla war from 1812 to 1815. In 1812, Dominica's enslaved population had reached its zenith, with 24,000 enslaved, 1,500 free people of color, and 800 white persons. Decades of violence followed in the form of the Maroon Wars, with Dominica's planter class determined to retain its system of forced labor. By the end of the 1820s, however, the crumbling of the old system became increasingly clear. The sugar economy of the West Indies was declining in importance, and Britain itself continued to experience major agitation for social change, both for its own populace and for the people of its colonies. Uprisings in Barbados, Demerara, which is now a part of Guyana, and Jamaica further foreshadowed the end of the slave era. The Roman Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829 recognized the right of Roman Catholics, not only in Britain but also in her colonies, to hold public office for the first time since the 16th century. For Dominica, this meant Roman Catholics might challenge the Protestant-dominated assembly. In 1830, Dominica abolished all legal discrimination on the basis of color. Many of these new free people of color were Roman Catholic. In 1836, the Dominican House of Assembly became the first British colonial legislature to be controlled by a majority of African descent. On August 1, 1838, Dominica's slaves were fully emancipated. However, the struggle was far from over. The Emancipation Act granted compensation not to the former slaves, but rather to their masters for their loss of property. Thus, 14,175 former slaves were left with nothing to begin their free lives except the hope and determination wrought from decades of fighting, as well as the knowledge and conviction that they could create a self-sustaining republic. During the 19th century, the external weakness of the colony served to strengthen the role of the Maroons from within. Maroons and Kalinago together farmed the rugged terrain sustainably. This collective self-reliance, combined with publicity about the French Revolution and the founding of Haiti, the world's first black-led republic and the first independent Caribbean state, sustained the Maroons through decades of bloodshed. Until 1958, Dominica was governed as part of the British Windward Islands, then was part of the West Indies Federation beginning in 1958 until the Federation's dissolution in 1962. In 1967, it became an associated state of the United Kingdom, with autonomy regarding its internal affairs. On November 3, 1978, exactly 485 years after Columbus first landed and assigned the island the name by which we know it today, the Commonwealth of Dominica became an independent, sovereign republic. It became a member of the United Nations on December 18th of that same year. To recapitulate what I stated at the beginning of this talk, Dominica's independence is especially significant because it was the only country to transition directly into independence as a republic among those of the Commonwealth, and to date is the only member of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States for which the head of state is elected from within, rather than serving in the role of a governor-general. The unique scenario of Dominica's colonial era signals the need to avoid overgeneralizing small states as weak or dependent. Rather, they should be recognized as subjects and agents, not objects of a world of powerful states and non-state actors. Whatever their vulnerabilities, the decisions and actions of such small countries are their own, and Dominica is a clear example of this autonomous identity. What then is the significance of all this beyond knowing about Dominica itself? To answer this, I shall return to the concept of Dominica as a microcosm. As I stated at the beginning, the challenges of globalization, climate change, and human security faced by Dominica resemble what so many small countries confront on a regular basis. The uniqueness that rests with Dominica's Maroon legacy summons its citizens to preserve the island republic's identity in the face of global forces that threaten it. Yet, at the same time, Dominica, like all other countries, large and small, must survive and hopefully thrive in a highly competitive and globalized economy and society. Therefore, because of what it has in common, as well as what distinguishes it from the rest of the world, Dominica offers valuable insights for further research, as well as for courses in international relations and comparative politics. Thank you very much.